Released on September 10th, 2010, Pokémon Black and White would quickly gain the title of Pokémon's most controversial game, with at the time being considered the worst mainline game by fans. This was due to various reasons, like not being able to encounter Pokémon from previous generations until the end of the game, and having a more linear map and story. However, unlike previous Pokemon games, Pokemon Black and White would attempt a more serious story about Pokemon oppression, liberation, and the ethics of capturing creatures and forcing them into battles. And the story would be led by a mysterious man named N, a young man who has the ability to communicate with Pokemon and believes all Pokemon should be liberated and allowed to be set free. But N didn't choose this life. He was raised in isolation and manipulated from the very beginning. So today, I wanted to take a look at the tragedy of N, the orphan boy who became a pawn in an evil scheme. As a young child, N was abandoned in the woods and left to be raised by wild Pokemon. This led to N gaining the ability to communicate with Pokemon and understand how they think and feel. However, one day, N was approached by a cloaked figure named Ghetsis, who adopted him and became his foster father. Ghetsis would begin preparing N for a role in his organization, Team Plasma, an empire dedicated to the liberation of Pokemon. Ghetsis would seclude N within a castle, only allowing him to interact with Pokemon that had been abandoned or abused by their trainers. This reinforced the idea that trainers and Pokemon should be separated, which made him the perfect pawn in Ghetsis' master plan. And once N had come of age, Ghetsis crowned him the king of Team Plasma and gave him a mission to seek out one of the legendary dragons and convince the people across Unova to release their Pokemon. Which leads us into the direct plot of Pokemon Black and White. The player first meets N at a speech made by Ghetsis in a Kumla town during the beginning of the game. When we first meet N, he's odd to say the least, addressing and speaking to your Pokemon first before questioning the player on whether either catching and making Pokemon battle is ethical. However, there are two other details from this encounter that I believe are important to understanding N's character. Firstly, unlike other trainers who are looking to test their strength or halt the player's progress, N instead wants to understand how the player's Pokemon feels about them, with N trying to find out if your Pokemon are truly happy with the player. And secondly, as pointed out by Sharon, N talks faster than any other character in Pokemon Black and White. Even when the speech setting is adjusted, N still speaks faster than any other character in the game. This is a small detail, but shows the effect of N's isolation. N grew up within a castle and wasn't allowed to leave all too often, so talking to the player may be one of N's first interactions with a person not from Team Plasma, resulting in him talking fast and not understanding many social cues. After defeating N in a battle, he says that keeping Pokemon in Pokeballs will only harm them before running off. The next time the player encounters N is in front of the Nakrine City Museum, where he questions the player if he wants to see a world where Pokemon become perfect, believing the only way to achieve this reality is by separating people and Pokemon. Now, N battling the player may seem strange, as it is harming the Pokemon, but some small details show insight into his reasoning for fighting the player. Firstly, N battles the player's Pokemon to see how they feel, as for all his life, he has grown up around Pokemon that were mistreated, which is why he's so baffled by the idea of the player's Pokemon enjoying battling. But another detail with all of N's battles is that every battle he has a new team of Pokemon, and most of the Pokemon that he catches are on the route that the player meets him on, meaning that he catches the Pokemon and releases them after the battle is finished. This is shown in a small cutscene in Pokemon Black and White 2, where N releases his Pokemon after a battle and does not understand why his Pokemon are sad to leave his side. Because Ghetsis sheltered N, he never understood the bond that trainers have with their Pokemon, which is why N is so insistent on battling the player, because he's never seen a bond like that before. After this small encounter, we next meet N in Nabasa City, where he takes us on a Ferris wheel to see if we can't spot some Team Plasma grunts. However, this was just a distraction to give this group of grunts enough time to escape. Once at the top of the Ferris wheel, N reveals that he is the king of Team Plasma and tells us Ghetsis' plan for N to befriend one of the legendary dragons, Reshiram or Zekrom, and defeat the Unova Grand Champion and influence the people of Unova to release their Pokémon. Here is also our first sign of N's confidence, with him daring the player to stop him. However, I don't believe this is part of N's personality, but Ghetsis', as N rarely shows any kind of overconfidence, mainly staying reserved. However, Ghetsis shows many signs of cockiness and overconfidence, so perhaps some of Ghetsis' behavior may have rubbed off on N. After a battle with N at the Ferris wheel, we next encounter N at Chargestone Cave. Here, N is confronted by Professor Juniper, where the two clash over the idea of a Pokédex. N expresses his disgust at categorizing Pokémon, believing it reduces them to nothing more than data instead of living beings. However, it is somewhat hypocritical for N to be disgusted with categorizing Pokémon, as N has been categorizing humans, saying that they are all abusing and mistreating their Pokémon. This is something N does often, criticizing how people treat their Pokémon when he does almost the exact same thing to trainers. But you really can't blame N, because Ghetsis didn't allow him to see the outside world, so he never really understood the bond between people and Pokémon. After the confrontation in Chargestone Cave, the player's next encounter with N is after defeating Skyla, the flying-type gym leader. Here, N talks with their Pokémon, who confide in N that they actually trust the player. N is glad to hear this, and wishes all trainers treated their Pokémon like the player does. This is different from how N has spoken previously, with him wanting all Pokémon and humans to be separate, believing that humans were holding Pokémon back from their greatest potential, to now believing that there's at least one trainer that treats their Pokémon well, however still believes the overwhelming majority of trainers mistreat their Pokémon. After this, we meet N at the top of Dragon Spiral Tower, where he successfully summons one of the legendary dragons and flies off to challenge the champion of Unova. But before leaving, N tells us to find the other legendary dragon, so both of you can fight as equals and decide whose beliefs are truly right. However, the two legendary Pokémon, Reshiram and Zekrom, are more than just two powerful dragons, but they represent the two opposing viewpoints between the player and N. Once upon a time, there were two twin heroes who sought to create a perfect world. However, they both disagreed on how to achieve this dream. One brother believed in always seeking the truth, even if it ends up being harmful, while one brother believes in following your ideals in the pursuit of dreams, even if these dreams aren't ones made in reality. This conflict would result in the legendary dragon of Unova splitting into two, with Reshiram representing the brother who believed in truth, and Zekrom representing the brother who fought for ideals. Which brings us to the modern day, with two people who want to create a perfect world, but can't agree on the proper way to do so. N wants people and Pokemon to be separated to ultimately help the Pokemon, but the player believes that people and Pokemon should work together because it eventually helps the both of them, with this conflict leading us to the final battle. After defeating the Elite Four and making our way to Unova's champion Alder, it is revealed that N has already defeated Alder with the power of one of the dragons and summons his castle, with N inviting the player inside to fight him with the opposing dragon. This results in an intense battle between N and the player, truth versus ideals, and ultimately N loses. N begins to realize that the world shouldn't follow just one ideal, but instead should strive for a perfect balance between truth and ideals. N learns that not all trainers are abusing or mistreating their Pokemon, and learns that the bond between people and Pokemon is a real thing. And the thing that ultimately convinced N was the player's bond with their Pokemon being stronger than his beliefs. However, as N makes this realization, Ghetsis barges into the room, berating N for losing and revealing that Ghetsis was using N's powers and emotions for his own gain. Ghetsis never wanted to liberate or help Pokemon. He tried to take away and convince people to release their Pokemon so that he could take over the world. Ghetsis effectively brainwashed N, making him the perfect puppet for his evil plan. Ghetsis never loved N, or even cared about him. He only saw N as his tool. After Ghetsis is defeated, N speaks with the player one last time. He thanks the player for showing him he was wrong, and says that he needs to go on a journey to truly understand the bond between people and Pokemon, and then flies off on his dragon. Which brings us to the plot of Black and White 2. Taking place nearly 2 years after the plot of Black and White 2 follows the aftermath of the original game, with Team Plasma being split into 2 factions. One faction stays loyal to N, attempting to help and protect Pokemon, while the other faction is led by Ghetsis, who plans on using the legendary Pokemon Kyurem to freeze all of Unova and bring forth a new Ice Age, which causes 2 entirely new trainers to attempt to soil Ghetsis' plan. However, just before Ghetsis uses Kyurem to attack the player, N shows up and saves them. But Ghetsis takes this chance to fuse Kyurem and N's dragon, making Kyurem even stronger, which results in an intense battle between the player and Kyurem, which results in Kyurem being defeated. N then confronts Ghetsis, telling him that Pokemon aren't tools to control, but partners to be respected. But Ghetsis ignores N's advice, instead continuing to berate and insult N. Ghetsis cannot change. He is an abusive hypocrite who dismisses all advice or help given to him. But N breaks the cycle. He walks away from the man who used him, leaving Ghetsis to face his crumbling empire that is Team Plasma alone. Ghetsis wanted power, but N wanted to save his friends, and that's what makes his story so tragic. And thank you all for watching. If you like this kind of content, leave a like and subscribe. It helps out the channel and shows me what content you enjoy. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!